Hi, we're continuing with the series on borderline personality disorder, specifically to assist parents, helping them to understand how to be good parents and to care for their adolescent child or young adult who has BPD. Um, what I want to talk about today is an outgrowth of a direct criteria, which is identity disturbance. Usually, with children, we want them to be, in a sense, disorganized, in the sense that we want healthy children to have the ability and to feel sufficiently confident that they can explore the world through sports and athletics and through arts, music, and in many, many other ways. You know, one of the most essential features of a healthy young child is exploration through playtime, socially, uh, through language, behaviorally, even exploring, for example, boundaries, saying no to parents staying up late when at 5 or 6 years old the child is told to go to bed at a very specific time. These are ways that we want and also encourage the young child and even adolescent to explore the world. It's complicated why this is healthy, but basically, children who are curious, as well as, by the way, adults, but children in particular who are curious, tend to do very well because they seem to be more open to different ideas and people and possibilities and so on. Um, Life is quite difficult for adults, and children who have the possibility and are able to entertain the idea that different things can occur. You know, you can go in this way, that way. You know, this career doesn't work out. You know, you can go in a different way in a different career, or you really enjoy your career, you want to stay with it, but your job is awful, or your supervisor is awful, you're in an awful place. That you take those same skills and you apply them in another company. Curiosity and flexibility are extremely important positive attributes for children and even young adults and older adults. It allows us to remain um, not just flexible, but malleable. It allows us to entertain the possibility that we're not always correct. It allows us to play with ideas. I can go on and on about this, but these are all attributes of healthy individuals. Um, in contrast, borderline children tend to do much better when they have grounded certainty. And parents of borderline children should really try to instill certainty and predictability for the child. And the most important form of certainty and predictability and understanding pertains to that child's identity. So that you want your child to feel that they have a specific identity with regard to who they are, their name, their personality, and so on. A specific identity with regard to their role in the family, identity with regard to their relationship with siblings and mom and dad, or perhaps others outside of the family. Identity is very important for borderlines. Certainty is very important because their internal world can be so chaotic and uncertain, and identity really helps them to maintain authenticity and to recapture authenticity when they feel that their world is chaotic as they grow into adulthood. There are other ways to ensure identity, a healthy identity formation for the borderline child and to maintain it, and that is to have a consistent relationship with the child to enforce and maintain in a healthy way proper boundaries, not to become um, overly anxious or depressed when things are not going well with the child, because the child will pick up on that very easily and blame themselves or internalize it or become confused. This is a very central issue for borderlines in general, is confusion about identity, They have perhaps difficulty processing information, cognitive confusion. And the way you deal with confusion is certainty, is predictability, is to have a very real identity and concrete sense of who that individual is. And you can enforce that in many other ways. For example, let's say your child enjoys, I don't know, a particular sport such as swimming. Really encourage it. Encourage the borderline child to take lessons, go to swimming 2-3 times a week, do lots of laps, maintain not just the sport out of love, but perhaps develop proficiency so that the child can feel very proud of his accomplishments and the swimming can become part of his identity. Doesn't mean the child has to do it for 30 years, but it's this kind of activity that allows consistency of identity. Another example can be with regard to family. This is a very serious issue because borderlines have ego boundary problems. They sometimes don't know where they start and where someone else stops, and they can identify or over-identify with other people in an unhealthy way, and we've spoken about this in other videos. And these are key criteria of BPD. Maintaining consistent roles and communication styles between parent and the child within the home can be very helpful. One thing to do are consistent household responsibilities. So, for example, if you have a rotating set of responsibilities for the children in terms of cleaning the kitchen or doing laundry or whatever it might be, then don't allow the child to shirk those responsibilities, because an important part of identity is responsibility. An important part of identity is to be responsible for yourself and responsible for others. There are other ways to enforce identity, such as cultural values that the parents may have, religious values, other values such as community or volunteer charity work. These things will help the child to better understand who he is through conduct, through behaviors. At the best of times, our identities are a composite of personal appearance, friendships, family, culture, our own particular proclivities, education, employment. Many, many things make up identity, including sexual identity. And it's important that the borderline child does not become overwhelmed through social contagion or through peer pressure, because the identity that child has is very fragile. And oftentimes with borderlines, they'll sometimes present with a strong outer stable veneer, but you scratch just underneath the surface and you see someone who's quite fragile and vulnerable. With identity disturbance, the borderline peers into the mirror and it's like looking through fog because he doesn't really get feedback. And the borderline often throughout his adolescence, like many adolescents, by the way, but particularly for borderlines and in young adulthood, he will strive to find meaning in his life, trying to find who he is. And it's often through experimentation. And as I said earlier, usually experimentation and curiosity for young children is really healthy and it should be encouraged. With borderlines, it needs to be closely monitored by the parent, because if some of that exploration and experimentation concerns impulsive, unhealthy activities such as gambling, spending a lot of money, sex, drugs, whatever, then it becomes very destructive. And those activities don't really serve to build identity. What they do for the borderline is it helps to quell internal psychic pain and anguish and uncertainty. Often what these impulsive activities do, obviously, is create greater chaos for the borderline and not greater certainty. Often the borderline suffers from identity disturbance because of disappointment in his self, and he may even harbor self-loathing, that is self-hatred, even though he enjoys the activities that he's engaged in. And it's important for a parent to monitor this so that, for example, with the swimming, if the child is engaged with swimming on a regular basis, it's important that the child is not doing this just to humor the parent, but to ensure that the child is enjoying it, getting some benefit out of it. Whenever our identities become fractured or uncertain, we become very anxious, and we may even hate ourselves because we don't recognize who we are when we look in the mirror. And it's not really possible to participate in life with any sense of enjoyment if we're constantly questioning our identity and our meaning in a kind of existential way. This can be very frustrating for the borderline. It can be very anxiety provoking. And there's nothing more anxiety provoking than not knowing who you are. So you don't want the borderline child to, in their 20s and 30s, to start experimenting with this. You want, as much as possible when the child is young, to have a real sense of identity in terms of family, community, and other things such as values, by the way. Values can be hard work and personal integrity. Values can be community volunteer or charity work. Values can include religious adherence to a particular faith or attending church or mosque or synagogue. Values can be connected to interpersonal responsibilities, but ultimately, hopefully, responsibilities towards oneself. The borderline's identity is so fragile that the borderline will sometimes attach onto another person and either assume or take aspects of that person's identity or mimic that identity, even in a mimetic way. That occurs when the borderline sees someone who is perhaps of higher social status, and the borderline will try to imitate aspects of that person's life in an effort to create meaning internally within his own life. We don't want the borderline's identity to be one of self-hatred, where there's internal identity fracture and almost the borderline seeing himself as the enemy. And when the internal world is so chaotic, having a very strong external structure can be very helpful. And sometimes it's even everyday things, such as eating family meals every day at 7 o'clock. I know it's not easy. Everybody has their own schedule, but it can be very helpful. Having family time with activities such as game night or cooking together, and so on. When it comes to interpersonal issues within the family, maintaining role and communication positions for the borderline child is extremely important, as I've said before. And this should be from an objective and a subjective standard, meaning objective where different people can see objectively where the borderline fits in, but subjectively the borderline should have a sense of his or her place within the family. The borderline should not have to guess. Now, normally you would say, well, you don't have to guess. You're a child. We love you. You come over every day. We feed you. We do things together. But when you have a core dysfunction of identity and you don't know who you are, it's very unsettling, and it needs to be reinforced so that when the borderline adolescent becomes a young adult and perhaps goes to college and moves out and so on, they will have a sufficiently positive sense of who they are, that when they interact with the outside world, they won't shatter because they're going to meet very different kinds of people than they were used to in the family of origin. They're going to be exposed to very different kinds of situations that they were not exposed to in the family of origin. They may be in a very different environment or community that they were not exposed to in their family of origin. And so the stronger the identity of that individual, the stronger they're going to be as young adults. Um, I think that's all what I want to say about that particular issue. Um, Whatever self knowledge the borderline has is really elusive at the end of the day, and providing constructive details of his identity and leaving the borderline with an empirical starting point, a structure. Borderlines do very well with structure, clear values, the reinforcement of love for who that particular person is will help that borderline to have a strong sense of their needs, responsibility, identity, how they communicate with others, their role within a very structured family system, and it would allow them a better fighting chance as young adults. I know this could be very, very difficult for parents because it seems so, in a sense, counterintuitive. A child grows up, they have a particular place within the family. But when your child has borderline personality disorder and the identity disturbance is very severe, understanding and being sensitive to that can be very helpful for the child throughout their core years of development.